If you're active in any place where War Thunder is discussed, you probably know that top tier has been the subject of some hot debate recently. Recently probably isn't the best word. People are always talking about it, but they seem to be very upset right now. For many players, top tier is the endgame, and it's what they play most of all. So when it's in such an incredibly unbalanced state, it's bound to make their blood boil. Right now, Russian teams are absolutely dominating that BR range. With an average win rate of around 70%, something is very obviously wrong. In the games I played to get background footage, we won every single one. But other nations have had win rates that high before. Why is it such a big deal this time? The difference is that when these nations were dominating, they didn't receive a ton of new toys. Germany received the 2A6 to follow up the 2A5, but they still lacked a lot of supporting vehicles. This is not the case with Russia. Even though they are the largest tech tree and have the best top tier lineup, they received even more top tier vehicles. And it looks like that trend may continue in the future. Players will say that Russian tanks aren't very good. They just have a lot of them and keep respawning, winning the battle of attrition. I do think it's a contributing factor, but it's certainly not the only one. For some reason, players often make it out like Russian MBTs are universally bad compared to NATO tanks. The commonly cited downsides are poor survivability, poor gun handling, a lack of gun depression, and slow reverse speeds. While I wouldn't argue with most of these points, I think it's disingenuous to list the cons in a vacuum and say that makes them bad. It's true that Russian MBTs generally don't have fast reaction times, and it's true that they have a harder time using hills to their advantage, but these are issues that can be worked around. And in exchange for these cons, you get a very low profile, relatively small weak spots, great forward mobility, solid turning speeds, and a great high explosive round. Oh, and one other thing. On tanks like the T-72B3, T-80 BVM, and Sprut SDM-1, the sights are amazing. Not only do they have fairly high FOV, but the vignette practically doesn't exist. Thermal resolution is also great, with the sights ranging from Gen 2 to Gen 3. A lot of US tanks are still rocking Gen 1, and let me tell you, it makes a huge difference. Personally, I have a great time playing Russian MBTs. When I'm playing them, I don't feel like I'm at a disadvantage. I typically do better actually. They suit my generally aggressive playstyle very well. Despite what some people will say, Russia has some great MBTs, and that's definitely one reason for their high win rates. Another contributing factor is that, generally speaking, experienced players will flock to whatever's doing best. If you're playing top tier all the time and tired of getting stomped by Russia, why not join them? In the games that I played, I found that most of my Russian teammates were fairly skilled, while a lot of our opponents were somewhat less so. Of course, this isn't a universal truth. Your team will always vary from match to match, but it was a fairly common theme. It could also be that players want to research the relatively new T-80 BVM, but at this point, I doubt flavor of the month has much to do with it. Circling back to the whole NATO spawns less thing, it is sort of true, but not in the way people typically think. In the games that I played, I didn't notice substantially less deaths on the NATO side, and at the end of the match, both teams had roughly the same number of players. The issue was that the enemy team would usually die once or twice, spawn a jet or helicopter, then they would essentially contribute nothing to the match. Most of the time, they would get shot down right away. Sometimes they would get 1 or 2 kills, but given how expensive aircraft are spawn point cost-wise, it didn't offset the cost. In the brief time that all these aircraft are flying around, Russian tanks on the ground are pretty much uncontested. It doesn't help that Russia has a lot of ways to counter air threats, which brings us back to the tech tree argument. It is true that Russia has a lot of MBTs, but they also have what I consider to be the best support vehicles in the game. They have one of the best SPAA, an 8.3 IFV that works perfectly well at 11.0, a great top tier light tank, one of the only top tier ATGM carriers, some very viable CAS options, and of course the Kamovs. There isn't a single area where I'd say top tier Russia is weak. In fact, I would say they dominate most areas. Matchmaking is also fairly favorable towards Russia. I noticed they get paired with Germany quite a bit. And Leopard 2A6s aren't weak at all. They fill what small capability gaps Russian teams have. Essentially, the situation is a perfect storm. Not only does Russia have an abundance of vehicles, but they're quite good, their competition wastes spawn points on aircraft, they get matched with very strong nations, and to top it all off, experienced players are flocking to play them. The situation could be resolved fairly easily. Actually fill capability gaps in other tech trees. Don't just add slight variations of MBTs, and stop adding top tier stuff to Russia for a bit. That'll push players towards other tech trees. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one.